In the middle of the 14th century, a particularly nasty outbreak of bubonic plague ravaged Europe, killing up to half of the population at the time. This event has been memorialized as the Black Death, so named for the horror it wrought upon medieval communities. It's an unhappy coincidence that the disease can also discolor the extremities, turning them black as your body starts to die while you still breathe. Before the advent of modern medicine, bubonic plague had up to a 90% mortality rate. If you caught the Black Death, you had only a 1 in 10 chance of surviving. Europe had known disease before, but none this deadly. For 1,000 years following the fall of the Western Roman Empire, medieval Europeans had lived under a system called feudalism, a rigidly hierarchical social structure where resources are funneled from laborers tied to the land, called serfs or peasants, up to the nobility and royalty. The vast majority of the population did all the work, tilling the fields and gathering crops and shoeing horses and smithing swords and crafting pots and pans and windows and tables and hammers and nails and building big fuck-off castles and churches. Well, those at the top threw birds around and watched idiots ride horses at each other with big sticks, eating every last crumb they could fit into their gullets. It's a wonder this lasted as long as it did, and certainly there were peasant rebellions every so often, but the kings and the lords under them would justify their positions by claiming that God had ordained them to rule the realm, that they had inherited from their father, who had inherited from his father, who had inherited from his father, who took it at the point of a sword, or by arguing that the knights they could field were needed to protect them from scary invaders from Scandinavia or the eastern steppes. Therefore, keep working in the fields and workshops while we sit on our asses doing nothing all day. Thank you.
See how I do it.
But when half the people in your village die, it makes your own personal labor worth a lot more. And after the Black Death, many peasants decided they'd be able to make a better living by moving to a city, where they could charge actual money for their services rather than just the privilege of working for their king. It didn't happen overnight, but inevitably feudalism collapsed, and the nobility were largely replaced by the rising merchant class, who realized that it wasn't the crown and the throne that gave you power, but simply having lots of money.
We've got to have money.
Hence, capitalism. The idea of workers banding together for mutual benefit is a very old idea, but prior to industrialization, it was realized in the guild system. Guilds have been recorded as far back as ancient Mesopotamia, and they're essentially an exclusive club you get to join if you are a proven artisan. Guilds could be broad, such as a general metalworkers guild, or they could get real niche, like having separate guilds for blacksmiths, locksmiths, goldsmiths, or whatever else. The idea of a guild is twofold. First, that requiring artisans belong to a guild protects the consumer, as guild members are required to sell at guild prices, and being a guild member means you have enough skill at your trade to have been admitted, guaranteeing a certain expectation of quality. Second, the guild protects its members by ensuring them employment and using their resources to help them with legal or other issues. The guild would also punish anyone found plying the guild's designated trade without being a member. However, keep in mind that, at least in medieval Europe, the idea of a business, where one person owns the means of production and hires salaried workers to use them, didn't really exist. Guild members were essentially independent contractors, self-employed. The most you'd have for an employee would be an apprentice training under you, with the idea that once they learned the trade, they'd become independent craftsmen themselves. It is with the rise of capitalism and the idea of a private corporation that guilds began to lose their influence and disband. Now, rather than working for yourself under the auspices of a guild you were an equal member of, you were employed by a rich person who gave you a salary for your efforts. In the end, the serfs shrugged off their kings, only to be taken in by bosses of businesses. You might think this an improvement. After all, now you're getting paid, but now you can also enjoy the privilege of being fired. Under feudalism, there's at least the pretense that your lord is required to ensure your safety. Otherwise, what's the point?
Well, I didn't vote for you.
Under capitalism, all the boss owes the worker is a wage for services rendered and nothing more. Lose your hand in the big crunchy machine? Occupational hazard. Oh, and I'm gonna need you to work 10-hour days, 7 days a week. Gotta keep those factories churning. Your kids, too, need their little fingers for the fiddly bits. The Industrial Revolution, for all the improvements it made to human life and inventions, was horrifying in its treatment of laborers, and eventually those laborers decided that enough was enough. They banded together again, demanding higher wages, shorter hours, a weekend to rest, and for their children to be allowed to be children, to get an education. And when the rich bosses refused, thinking only of their profits, the workers would refuse to work. Sometimes this would backfire, and the boss would just fire the striking workers and bring in new ones. After all, there are plenty of people looking for a job, but sometimes it would succeed, and eventually governments began to involve themselves in the disputes. That's how we got child labor laws. That's how we got 8-hour work days. That's how we got the weekend. Not the benevolent mercy of rich business owners, unions. Following the Great Depression and coinciding with FDR's New Deal, the various creative forces at Hollywood began to unionize. The Screen Actors Guild, or SAG, formed in 1933, along with the Screen Writers Guild, which would later split into East and West divisions in the US. The Directors Guild would later form in 1936. As for animators, there were a number of organizations that would eventually become the Screen Cartoonists Guild, and their efforts through the 1930s led to almost every major animation studio signing union contracts. As Leon Schlesinger capitulated and signed Warner Brothers into the union, he reportedly asked, "What about Disney?" At this point in history, Disney had become the name in feature animation. Snow White had been a runaway success, and while World War II cut off European markets for them, Pinocchio and Fantasia were still relatively popular in the Americas, though unable to recoup their budgets. However, while successful with the artistic output of his studio, Disney struggled on the actual logistic end of things. While the profits from Snow White helped build a brand new animation studio in Burbank, how the animators themselves were treated was a mess. There were massive pay disparities, and not just the usual bigotry-related ones like the gender pay gap, but as reported by animator Willis Pyle, there was no rhyme or reason as to the way the guys were paid. You might be sitting next to a guy doing the same thing as you, and you might be getting $20 a week more or less than him. Promised bonuses from Snow White's profits never materialized, animators were not receiving on-screen credit for their work, and employees were being told to sign documents saying they'd only worked 40 hours a week when they often were forced into overtime. Now, Disney did have a union at this time, a company union, the Federation of Screen Cartoonists, which had all the authority of a high school student senate and was under the direct control of Disney himself. All of this came to a head when Art Babbitt, the creator of Goofy, and then a leading figure in the company union, decided to sign with the Screen Cartoonists Guild. This was a bit of a shock to a lot of people, including Walt. Despite all the grievances the Disney artists had, they were still some of the best paid workers in the industry, and Babbitt himself was one of the best paid animators in the studio. Nevertheless, Babbitt was sympathetic to the lesser paid workers at Disney, and he, along with the heads of the SCG, tried to pressure Walt into signing his studio to an actual union. In response, Walt gathered his entire studio, all 1,200 artists who worked for him, into an auditorium and gave a bullshit speech about picking themselves up by their bootstraps that Ayn Rand would have been proud of. Needless to say, this didn't go over very well, and more animators at Disney signed with SCG. Walt saw this as a betrayal and fired the unionizing workers, including Babbitt. This, strictly speaking, wasn't legal, as a few years earlier in 1935, Congress had passed the Wagner Act, forbidding employers from taking retributive action against employees trying to unionize. The very next day, 200 Disney workers walked out and began a strike. Now, what had they been working on? A little picture called Dumbo. Dumbo is basically an hour-long anti-bullying PSA. Not gonna lie, there ain't really much here to work with. Aside from Dumbo and his mom, everyone in this movie is just a raging asshole.
It's all the fault of that little Freak.
Including Timothy Mouse, who mostly views the big-eared elephant as a meal ticket. The animation isn't really much to write home about either, as after Pinocchio and Fantasia weren't as successful as hoped, Walt explicitly asked for something simpler and cheaper, which is why this movie is only an hour long, makes minimal use of the multiplane camera, and has watercolor backgrounds as opposed to the more expensive and time-consuming oil paints used in the other films of the Golden Age. The main bulk of the movie is Dumbo just being treated like utter shit by everyone else around him. There's a short interlude where he and the mouse accidentally get drunk, and then he learns to fly, and suddenly the movie's over. Something, something, ugly duckling, something, something, be nice to disabled people. But the film makes no argument for systemic change. The ringleader ostensibly remains in charge of the circus despite his rampant animal abuse. The animals still belong to the circus, even if Mrs. Jumbo gets her own private car now. It really is just a showcase of Randian exceptionalism. When Dumbo is a helpless child with big ears, he gets ripped from his mother, who is only trying to defend him, and he is subjected to verbal and physical abuse constantly. But once he starts to fly, suddenly those ears are insured for $1 million, and he's the star of the show. As Rankin Bass would show us with Rudolph a couple decades later, deviation from the norm will be punished unless it is exploitable.
Kids, could you lighten up a little?
Speaking of exploiting, the elephants are forced to do all sorts of manual labor in addition to their circus duties, like hauling the tent together. You know, these circus animals would really benefit from a union, especially since
they work for peanuts.
And speaking of working for peanuts, there are a lot of sequences in this film that are very clearly not made by the cream of the crop of Disney animation. This was partly deliberate, because the whole point of Dumbo was to fart out something as quickly as possible to make back the losses from the previous two films, but also partly inadvertent, as a lot of the possible talent that could have been used walked out during the strike, leaving a lot of moments that just look sloppy, amateurish, or unfinished. Now, of course, even the worst animator at Disney is going to be fantastic compared to a lot of other studios, but when compared to the other films of the Golden Age, it's pretty clear which one's the odd one out. Another little thing, the whole stork myth has always been weird to me. The idea that sex is such a taboo thing that it
Couldn't be talked about.
to the point that even pregnancy is too much for kids to handle. So when Junior asks where babies come from, the adults all go, a bird brings babies. Phew, dodge that bullet. And never mind that the immediate next question in Junior's head is going to be, well, where did the stork get the baby?
And then Mommy kissed Daddy, and the angel told the stork, and the stork flew down from heaven and left a diamond under a leaf in the cabbage patch, and the diamond turned into a baby.
Our parents are having a baby, too. They had sex.
It's basically the same as going, God created the universe, because the immediate follow-up can only be, well, who created God? But that's a subject I don't think I'm ready to tackle in this series yet. Maybe when we get to Hunchback. Anyway, the end result is we have this single female mother who only lives with other single females being suddenly handed a child that she is clearly expecting in the first few minutes of the film. Parthenogenesis is not a normal behavior for pachyderms.
Life, finds a way.
It's just profoundly weird and juvenile to me to euphemize such an important life moment to the point of ridiculousness, and I'm glad that Lady and the Tramp eventually revisits the idea of pregnancy and childbirth in a much more mature, nuanced, and satisfying way. Now, that's not to say there isn't some good in this film. The emotional centerpiece of the movie, the song Baby Mine, is very well placed and surprisingly effective. There's a reason why this was the only song to make it into the live-action remake, and the entire pink elephant sequence is wonderful, almost like something out of Fantasia, really letting the animators run wild. And while this probably wasn't deliberate, in a modern context, the ringleader going on and on about how he needs a climax is fucking hilarious.
The climax!
Also, this joke is pretty good, not gonna lie. But other than that, the movie is almost mean-spirited, practically reveling in how much abuse can be heaped on this literal child. And then, of course, there's the stuff a fair few of you have probably been waiting for me to talk about, the racist caricatures. Remember the bit with the elephants raising the tent? That's happening during a song where the human workers, who seem to all be black, sing about how they and how they're happy with their work, and how they're not paid much, but would waste it all if they got any more. Oh, and of course there's this.
Grab that rope, Harry!
Yikes! Gross and repugnant. I honestly have no idea how anyone at Disney, from the songwriter to the animator to Walt himself, thought this was in any way okay to produce. But what most people remember from this movie are the crows. Let's talk about those crows. First off, yes, during production the lead crow was named Jim Crow, which, Holy hell! For reference, after the U.S. Civil War, but before the Civil Rights Movement 100 years later, there were a number of laws in southern states restricting the rights of African Americans, collectively, colloquially called Jim Crow laws. The name refers to a character created by a white blackface actor, which then became a pejorative for black folk in general. And this cartoon character was named for that! Nowadays, Disney calls him Dandy Crow, which is certainly better, but he should never have been named the original way in the first place. Not helping matters is that his voice actor was white! In fact, the same guy who voiced Jiminy Cricket! Y'all are really burning through the goodwill the first 3 films got you, Disney. At least the other 4 crows actually have black voice actors, which is something. Now, while the crows are not depicted as servile or fawning, which was the issue with the Pickaninny Centaur cut from Fantasia, they are still playing into a stereotype of African Americans being lazy and carefree. And yes, I know these are birds, not people, but they are still given black accents, and the way they move is in a manner that 1940s audiences would have associated with black people. The animators based said movements on those of African American vaudeville dancers, and while that does lend the sequence more authenticity, it doesn't make up for everything else involved here. I wish I could watch this movie divorced from its cultural context, because on a surface level viewing, those crows seem hip and cool and honestly a lot of fun to hang out with. But they are playing the role that white folk projected onto African Americans following the Civil War of being idle and lazy and spending their time doing nothing productive, and it's at this point that certain right-leaning older individuals in the room will start waxing poetic into their Bud Light or box wine that black people had it better under slavery. Having a master actually gave them productivity and purpose. And anyone who actually thinks like that can take a rosebush and shove it all the way up their ass. Now, the song the crows sing is fun and catchy, but again, it was written by a white guy, and it's performed by a white guy who was doing his best audio-only blackface.
But I be done seen about everything when I see an elephant fly.
And to top it off, the crows end up filling one of the more egregious tropes in media regarding African Americans, that of the magical Negro. This is a character in fiction who is black, whose only purpose in the narrative is to give some sort of advice or tangible aid to the white protagonist. Think Whoopi Goldberg in Ghost.
You in danger, girl.
Or Whoopi Goldberg in Star Trek. Often this character is literally magical, but not all the time, as we see here with the quote-unquote magic feather. It's a trope that only serves to other and undermine black people, and it's a trope that needs to be left in the past. There are some in recent years who have tried to argue in defense of the crows, but most of them are white, and their arguments come off as very defensive and patronizing. Now there are exceptions. Hello again, Whoopi Goldberg. She has been one of the leading figures in the movement to preserve older animation, including racially insensitive pieces, most notably disclaiming,
And these jokes were wrong then, and they are wrong today. But removing these inexcusable images and jokes from this collection would be the same as saying they never existed.
And that is a fine sentiment to have, and I am certainly not arguing that Dumbo needs to be banned or even censored or edited. This comes back to the point I made in the Fantasia video about the tension between wanting representation and that representation being a stereotype or caricature. To some in the black community, the crows may seem liberating and uplifting with their joie de vivre, and the fact that they're the ones who helped Dumbo to fly can be a source of pride. But to others, they are an uncomfortable reminder of how African Americans were viewed in the first half of the 20th century. It's honestly a shame that this movie is weighed down by so much baggage, because Dumbo himself is a perfect piece of character design. He is adorable, he is baby, he has never done anything wrong, and there's a reason why he's used so often in Disney marketing. What's wild is that he was animated by Bill Teitla, who previously had put such life into the villains, Stromboli and Chernabog. Teitla based Dumbo's movements on his 2-year-old son, and that's probably a lot of what makes the baby elephant so believable and lovable. The film has its charms, and the message of be nice to disabled people is decent enough. But the horribleness of so much of the cast and the prominence of the racist caricatures really makes this one a tough watch. Not to mention the drop in quality due in part to the strike. Honestly, if you're thinking of watching this movie, just look up the pink elephant sequence on YouTube and watch that. I can't really in good faith recommend the entire movie to anyone except an animation historian. It is sometimes claimed, including by myself previously in my video on the history of the Disney canon, that the clowns are parodies of the striking animators. However, on further research, I found that this particular sequence was animated by Art Babbitt. Yes, the guy who led the strike in the first place. With regards to this assertion, he has said, People attached political significance to what happened there. You know, let's go on strike and so on. We weren't thinking strike at the time. In fact, there never would have been a strike if it hadn't been forced on us. That strike lasted just under 4 months. The picketing animators made iconic signs and received support from the Screen Cartoonists Guild and others, getting meals served by local unionized restaurants. Meanwhile, Technicolor, which was unionized, refused to process Disney films until the strike was resolved. Groups sympathetic to unions boycotted Disney cartoons, and Walt was furious. However, he had already been scheduled to visit Latin America at this time as part of the US government's Good Neighbor policy, in an effort to prevent Central and South America from siding with the Nazis. The footage and sketches taken during this trip would later form the basis for Saludos Amigos and The Three Caballeros. That's right, all of those animators and artists you see in the live-action parts of Saludos Amigos, including fan favorite Mary Blair, were technically scabs breaking a strike. But that strike followed Walt even to South America. The SCG kept tabs on where he was going, organized local protests, and contacted the State Department, arguing that any ambassador of the United States should comply with U.S. labor law. To resolve this, upon Walt's return to the country, everyone involved was dragged in front of the Conciliation Service, a former government agency whose entire purpose was to deal with labor disputes. With the weight of the federal government now leaning on him, Disney finally yielded, giving in to union demands. The Walt Disney Animation Studio has been a union shop ever since. But things couldn't go back to the way they were. While the strikers who had been fired were all rehired, Disney kept looking for ways to get rid of Art Babbitt, whom he felt had betrayed him. After one such new firing, Babbitt took his case all the way to the Supreme Court and won. But even after all that, it became clear that the two were just not going to get along. And soon after, Babbitt, along with several other Disney animators, left and joined United Productions of America, or UPA, which would become known for cartoons like Mr. Magoo and Dick Tracy. It sucks when you find out someone who created art you love turns out to be not such a great person. Wagner made some of the most iconic pieces of music in history, and he was a raging anti-Semite who helped lay the groundwork for the Nazi philosophy. Orson Scott Card wrote a landmark book calling for pacifism and cross-cultural understanding through the lens of the horrors of child soldiers, and he's an unrepentant homophobe. The less said about J.K. Rowling, the better. And Walt Disney, for all the art he made, or rather all the art his animators made, Walt didn't animate a single cell or even direct any of his movies, at the end of the day cared more about the profit he was able to make than about the lives and livelihoods of those working under him. He even testified to the House Un-American Activities Committee during the Red Scare that he believed the strike was incited by communists and threw two of the striking animators under the bus to be blacklisted. His public persona, particularly in his later years when he hosted his Wonderful World, is so genial and affable, the kind of grandpa you wished you had, and it is in large part a fiction, as most public personas are. And yet, he and his studio created some of my favorite pieces of art. We need to remember that everyone, even a prominent creator, is human, with flaws and foibles. Every person is saint and sinner both. We do them and ourselves a disservice when we focus only on the good things they've made, or only on the harm they've caused. Regardless of its quality or racially insensitive baggage, there is one unequivocally good thing that can be said about Dumbo. It saved the company. With its release and the profits it raked in, Disney was finally back in the black and able to fund new projects, including the following year's Bambi. Without Dumbo, there's no Cinderella, no Sleeping Beauty, no Lion King or Frozen. The name Disney might have been as much of a historical footnote as Fleischer, and Snow White as much of a one-hit wonder as Gulliver's Travels. So I suppose we can at least be grateful for that. Unions remain important today, even as capitalists continue to rail against them, though in subtler ways now. Now the propaganda talks about right to work and deregulation, and the fact that union dues are so high, and never mind that what you pay in union dues is more than made up for the increased salary and protection you get from being in a union. And if unions were so bad for you, then why do all these rich fuckers want to get rid of them? As we've seen from the recent strikes by the Writers Guild and SAG-AFTRA, unions can have a profound impact on their industry. One actor, or even a handful of individual actors complaining about working conditions or AI stealing their job would probably never amount to anything because capitalists simply do not care. But a union of all actors gets shit done. Whenever someone tries to talk you out of joining a union, ask yourself, What are they getting out of this? It certainly isn't your well-being. They want to pay you as little as possible while getting as much labor out of you as they can, and they know a union will prevent that. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm gonna go give myself a congratulatory pat on the back for going a whole video about unions without once mentioning Karl Marx. Ah, fuck. Join me next time as we romp through the forest with Bambi.